Welcome once more to Flashpoints. I'm Bob Orr. Joining me, Juan Zarate. He's our national security analyst. Juan, good to see you again.
Bob, good to see you.
We've talked a lot about ISIS. We've talked a lot about how to attack ISIS, and we know about the military campaign from the air. What about the key component of attacking ISIS financially? How does that happen?
Well, we've talked about this before, Bob. ISIS has developed what I call a hybrid form of funding itself. It is running a war economy. It is actually funding itself with activities on the ground, having run the refineries, having controlled the food granaries, controlling elements of the economy itself, taxing it, extorting it, even controlling elements of the antiquities trade, the looting and the excavation. So they've learned to graft themselves onto the economy and profit from it. So that is a huge part of their budget. The other part is that they rely to a certain extent, not wholly, but they rely to a certain extent on the global jihadi investors who are interested in supporting this new caliphate, its cause, and in particular what it's doing effectively in Syria, which is fighting the Assad regime. And so you have the duality of local war economy funding and external funding. And the trick is, how can you dislodge them from their sources internally, and how can you cut them off from that support externally? And where are those touch points that you can affect either from a Treasury Department standpoint or from law enforcement and intelligence?
All right, let me ask you this. This is a terrorist group. They proclaim themselves a state. They're not really a state. They don't have a broad functioning economy of their own. How do you go after a non-state with sanctions? I mean, who do we slap sanctions on?
Yeah, we're not talking about a nation, and as you said, we're not talking about a lot of formal institutions. But the reality is they have to operate in the economy. They have to rely on elements of interaction, whether via cash or otherwise. And at some point, their business, their transactions, touch on elements of the financial system, whether it's money exchange operators across the border in Turkey, whether it's certain banks that may decide to do business with them. And interestingly, the Undersecretary of the Treasury just yesterday revealed that in the areas that ISIS controls, there are operating banks still. So they didn't go in and just rob them and shut them down. They didn't go in and blow them up and just steal everything from the vault. They are actually allowing it to operate. They're taxing it and maybe using it to settle and move money.
So these are ISIS banks, essentially. They operate because ISIS allows that, and they're taking a cut.
That's right, and it's a demonstration of the model. They're grafting on top of the economy, right? They're not shutting things down. They're actually recruiting people to work in it, and then they're using the facilities. Now the question is, how much are they using it? How much have they co-opted this? And then the question for the U.S. Treasury and the international financial community is, what do you do about it? Because these bank branches, in essence, are tied to the Iraqi banking system and perhaps other elements of the...
So how do we go after part of the Iraqi banking system at a time when we're trying to prop up a pretty shaky Iraqi government?
Yeah, you don't want to destroy or implode the Iraqi banking system, of course. It needs that to run as a functioning economy. It's a little bit like ISIS's control of the oil infrastructure. You want to dislodge them from it, but you don't want to destroy the infrastructure while you're doing it. The same thing in the banking world. So Treasury is likely going to have to consider certain measures that tailor advice to banks and maybe even some regulatory parameters for carving out those particular branches, identifying them perhaps one by one that are under ISIS control or maybe influence, and notifying to the international financial system, and in particular U.S. banks, be on the lookout, don't do business with them, and in fact you may be required not to do any business with them. The trick there, though, is does that spook the financial world from doing any business in Iraq or with any Iraqi banks? And that's really the trick and balance here. But the reality is ISIS is running an economy to include certain banks.
And just quickly, we've got to wrap up, but have we been successful at all in limiting their financing, in cutting into their margins?
Well, it appears that some of the military strikes that were tied to blocking supply lines and hitting the oil infrastructure and their control of it has had some effect. No doubt, though, they're still running parts of the oil infrastructure, and they are running the economy in places like Mosul and Fallujah, where they still are operating like a state. And as I've said all along, including in my op-ed in the New York Times last June, physically you're going to have to dislodge this group from the areas they control, not just because they control it, but because that's where they get their resources.
Story we obviously have to watch. Juan, thank you.
Thank you, Bob.
And thanks to you for watching Flashpoints. I'm Bob Orr. We'll see you next time.